Good evening. It's great to see you again. It's Sunday night, and I just finished my shift at the hospital, maybe about a few hours ago, 2 or 3 hours. And I have two noteworthy experiences tonight from the emergency department. One, the typical serious story, and one a little more comical. So to start, I walked into the hospital, to the emergency room today. And as soon as I walk in, I notice that there's a group of people, I would say about 10 to 12 people, who were all dressed in their Sunday best in the emergency room. And as soon as I got there, I found they were all there to visit a patient that had been admitted into the ED. So after I checked in and did all the logistical work that I do whenever I start a shift, I learned more information about this patient from the attending nurses and the other clinical care technicians throughout the emergency department. This patient was in the psychiatric ward, so we had to take a little extra caution around him, just as protocol. But to my best fortune, this patient was asleep for my entire shift. The patient himself was not the interesting part of my shift, but rather his family and friends who came to visit him. These family members, I had learned, had just come from church and were visiting their son, cousin, and fellow church parishioner. There were maybe 7 fellow parishioners that were about this child's age. I would say he was no more than 16, and all of his fellow parishioners were about the same age. Some seemed younger, some a little older. And his 2 other cousins were visiting, and so was his mother, a very concerned mother at that. So, in talking to the family and friends, I learned that he had come in after a small panic attack episode-like symptom that he had been exhibiting over the past couple of days. And after it had drawn itself out for much longer than initially expected, he was brought to the emergency room at the hospital. Now I saw that the patient himself was not that grief-stricken, mainly because he was sleeping. I could not communicate with him or really get any of his personal needs met. So I brought my attention to his family and friends. I started off simply by getting a drink order, and almost everyone wanted water. Being one person, it's difficult to transport 9 to 12 glasses of water at once, so naturally I did this in waves. Upon delivering all of the cups of water, everyone seemed very appreciative, and at that point I took it upon myself to engage in conversation with all of them, learn about why they're all here, and what was really going on in their world. Now, they all conveyed to me that they really cared about this patient, each one of them in a very different way. His mother, of course, being the one who was most concerned. It was hard for me to communicate with his mother because English was not her native language. She was communicating with her other relatives in a dialect that I could not personally identify. If I had to take my best shot, I would say it was a Creole dialect with a slight French appearance, or it presented itself with a French demeanor. Nevertheless, her relatives were able to understand and comprehend this lady very well and conveyed to me her message. And upon receiving her message, all she wanted was another glass of water. Yet it was very difficult for me to understand at first, being in a different language. So, after attending to this entire family the best I could, I found their spirits to be quite lifted from when I initially entered the emergency department. I take a great deal of pride in that, as I spoke to you about last week. Not the sense that I'm personally making them feel better, but just the fact that they're feeling at ease. It doesn't matter who makes the relatives feel better, just as long as at the end of the day they are feeling better about the situation they're in. It's a very grieving process, as easily seen on the faces of all the family members and friends. And just to be able to put a smile on just one of them is enough to start the trend of both healing and turning around to pick up the pieces and resume from when they left off. Now, in addition to being there for him, they were also a little frantic about his condition. They all wanted to know what was going on specifically with their patient. Not being a medical professional myself at this point, working for the hospital, I could not give or divulge any information out to them. It's against HIPAA policy for me to do so, as I'm not an employee, and it's against the hospital's protocol and procedures. Again, I'm not an employee of the hospital, I'm just a volunteer. Now, after talking to the emergency staff, specifically the two nurses and technicians who were attending to this patient, we both came to an agreement that the amount of visitors for this one patient in the emergency department might have been excessive. Now, I'm not going to be the one to judge. I feel if someone in my family were to be in a state of harm, I would want to personally visit him or her myself, and I understand this family and friends' sentiments entirely. The ED staff sometimes can be a little cold, and this is an unfortunate side effect of being exposed to the medical profession for such a long time as the staff has been exposed to it. It's interesting to see how different views come from different points of view in the hospital. Patients, visitors, volunteers, and pay receiving employees all see situations very differently. And it was kind of interesting to see the roles out of each group's eyes and try to feel for each one. Now, I'm exposed mostly to the emergency department staff, so I get their viewpoints 90 to 95% of the time, unless it's a pressing matter that cannot be spoken about. Very rare that such an event would occur. But to see the views of all the family members was a little new for me. Sure, I've seen family before, family and friends, but never quite this many family and friends here to support this one patient. Regardless, I admired their willingness to come in, and I was even brought to see myself smiling at the fact that so many people cared for this one patient. In the hospital, we strive to care for a patient in different ways in trying to treat the patient and help them get on the road to recovery. However, I feel that this family and this boy's friends were able to bring a different type of healing that medical professionals themselves, with all their knowledge, their technology, and their expertise, could not even begin to deliver to this one patient. Empathy is one thing, sure, and so is bedside manner, but actual love from a source that you've been around for a very long time is a different form of healing. And together, I believe this is the reason this patient is healing so well. The medicinal expertise and the administered medications to this one patient is doing what it can to physically heal this patient. But I believe the support and love of this patient's family and friends is the emotional backbone that will allow this patient to receive a more quick recovery and be on his feet again in a faster amount of time. I should say a shorter amount of time, but in a much faster manner. Seeing that today was rather enlightening. It was very heartwarming, and I find that I would love to see that situation with any patient as long as the emergency department was able to accommodate for all of them. Granted, the hospital by itself has many different waiting rooms for patient families and friends. In the case of multiple families, they could easily be catered to and accommodated. One day I would like to see it that either through my own hands or through the hands of fellow medical practitioners and medical staff, that more beneficial accommodations be offered to these patients. Money, unfortunately, is a reality, and that's always taken into consideration when trying to help family members, friends, and patients alike within the emergency department. I would one day like to see that money be less of a factor and the actual wanting to take care of both patient and family alike is a priority and a prerogative of hospitals around the country. Now, to a more comical event that occurred in the hospital today, which I refer to as the Ice Bucket Challenged. Not Ice Bucket Challenge, but Ice Bucket Challenged. In order to be an employee of the hospital, one must have a certain level of expertise in his or her own field in which he or she applies his skills to help the patients and hospital alike. But on occasion, we run into that certain type of employee who just can't seem to function as well as he or she should in a foreign setting. I speak specifically of non-medicinal equipment. There are some brilliant minds that work in this hospital, whether they be nurses, doctors, technicians, pharmacists, or any specialized medical professionals. They're very good at what they do. But when it comes to outside materials and outside usage of materials, it tends to deviate just a little bit. This gentleman who came down from another floor came down to use our ice machine to dispense ice for one of his patients. The floor in which he works had no working ice machine because it broke the day before. So he comes down and he's looking to operate this motion censored ice machine, and he's pushing on any and every item that looks like it might resemble a button to dispense ice. Little did he know there was a motion sensor in behind. Being as polite as possible, I went out of my way to show him that there was a motion sensor. And once he realized there was a motion sensor, he still could not adequately operate the ice dispenser. So I stuck around and held my hand over the ice dispensing sensor so that he could gather all the ice that he needed to fill his bag. This is why I've deemed this the Ice Bucket Challenged. A little comedy in the hospital and a little humor. Never hurt anyone. Regardless, it's amazing to see how many professionals have issues with things that seem very sensible and very easy to operate. Now, I'm not making any claims that every hospital personnel is unable to use everyday devices, but I am making the claim that some people who are professionals in a hospital could not function without their position, or rather the position in which they work in is one of the few positions they could excel in. This might come off as slightly cynical, and I understand that, but in a fast-paced environment such as the hospital, one needs to be able to adapt to the situation around him or her. One should be able to recognize that different atmospheres and different floors or different units in a hospital or any working environment will have different items, protocols, and utensils to help facilitate any and almost any process. To think that everything will be the same cookie cutter format between departments or hospitals or businesses is, in my opinion, a slightly flawed method of thinking. But if you're able to adapt and make a reasonable judgment off of what's around you, then I think you can create a very good, effective working environment for yourself, your coworkers, your patients, your clients, your representatives, and anyone that you have to interact with on a given day. I'm sure some of you are surprised that I'm not dumping a bucket of ice over my head and nominating 3 people to endure the same fate as me, I should say. Well, I assure you, this isn't meant to be comical. Neither is the hospital, but yet somehow they both end up being that way. Until next time, thank you for joining me. Have a lovely